The thermometer read 103 degrees. Inside Elsa Lindqvist's cabin, her 5-year-old son lay burning with fever, his temperature climbing past 104. Outside, smoke rose from a neighbor's grass fire. Cattle were dying of heat stroke. The smell of rotting meat drifted across Chisago County, Minnesota, as preserved food spoiled in homes throughout the valley. But Elsa walked to a small building behind her cabin, opened a heavy door, and felt cold air rush past at 38 degrees, 65 degrees cooler than the hell outside. She wrapped ice in cloth and pressed it to her son's forehead. He would live. Her neighbors had called her mad for building this. Now they were coming to beg. The thermometer nailed to the porch post read 103 degrees. Elsa Lindqvist pushed open the heavy door of the ice house and felt the cold rush past her like water from a mountain spring. Inside, the air hung at 38 degrees, 65 degrees cooler than the hell burning outside. She grabbed a block of ice with hands that had stopped shaking hours ago, wrapped it in burlap, moved fast. Behind her, smoke rose from the Carlson farm where grass had caught fire in the heat. To the east, she could hear cattle bellowing, Nielsen's prize dairy herd, dying of heat stroke one animal at a time. The smell of something rotting drifted from the Peterson place. Meat going bad. Butter turning to yellow soup. Elsa crossed the yard at a run. The heat hit her like opening an oven door. Her boots kicked up dust from soil that had cracked like old leather. Inside the cabin, 5-year-old Carl lay on the bed, his small body burning with fever. His lips were cracked. His eyes, when they opened, didn't quite focus. Anders and Britta sat beside him, too scared to cry. Elsa wrapped ice chips in cloth and pressed them to her son's forehead. His skin was so hot the ice began melting immediately, water running down his temples like tears. "Drink," she said, and held a cup of cold milk to his lips. Milk that should have soured hours ago in this heat. Milk that stayed sweet because it had spent the morning sitting on a block of ice that everyone said she was mad to harvest. Outside, a wagon rattled into the yard. Another neighbor coming to beg. But 8 months earlier, Elsa Lindqvist had stood beside her husband's fresh grave with $47, 3 hungry children, and a plan that would make her the laughingstock of Chisago County. Eric Lindqvist died on October 14, 1885, calling for his mother in a language his American-born children barely understood. Typhoid fever. It took 11 days to kill him. The doctor from Lindstrom charged $8 to watch it happen. The burial cost $12 more. By the time the last shovel of Minnesota dirt covered her husband's coffin, Elsa had $47 left to feed 3 children through winter and beyond. She stood at the grave until Anders tugged her sleeve. "Mama, Carl is cold." The boy was 5 years old. He didn't understand that his father was never coming home. He only understood that the October wind cut through his worn coat, and his mother was crying, and the world had become a frightening place. Elsa wiped her face, took his hand, walked back to the cabin that suddenly felt far too large and far too empty. That night, after the children slept, she sat at the kitchen table with a pencil and paper and did the mathematics of survival. $47. 1 milk cow worth perhaps $25, but selling the cow meant no milk for the children, no butter to trade. 6 chickens, 1 aging draft horse that Eric had called Old Gustav because the animal was as stubborn as his grandfather. 160 acres of land, but only 40 cleared for farming. The rest was oak scrub and marsh and rocks that seemed to grow from the soil each spring. She needed seed for spring planting. She needed to repair the chicken coop before the foxes found the gaps Eric had meant to fix. She needed firewood cords and cords of it to survive a Minnesota winter that could drop to 35 degrees below zero. And she needed food. Food that would last. Food that wouldn't poison her children. Last July, in the heat, they had lost a quarter of their preserved meat to spoilage. Carl had eaten salt pork that tasted slightly off, and for 3 days Elsa thought she would bury her youngest son beside the graves of 2 infants who had never survived their first year in America. He lived, barely. This winter she could salt meat, she could smoke it, she could dry what could be dried. But summer would come again. Summer always came, and summer in Minnesota was not the gentle season of her childhood in Sweden. Summer here was brutal, weeks of heat that turned milk to poison within hours and made preserved meat weep with spoilage. Other farms had spring houses, cold water running over stone, keeping butter firm and milk sweet. But Elsa's creek ran shallow and warm in summer, useless for cooling. Other farms had root cellars that kept vegetables through the hottest days. Elsa had a root cellar too. It held 55 degrees in summer. Not cold enough, not nearly cold enough for milk or fresh meat. She could buy ice from Stillwater, 28 miles south. The cost? $2.50 per 100 pounds, plus the cost of hauling. She did the math. To keep her family in ice through summer would cost more than she had to survive the entire year. The numbers did not work. The numbers could not work. A woman alone with 3 children could not work this land, and everyone in Chisago County knew it. 2 weeks after Eric's burial, Olaf Carlson's wagon rolled into her yard. Carlson was 58 years old. He had arrived in Minnesota in 1868, when the land was wilder and the winters even more deadly. He had buried his first wife in 71. He had watched neighbors freeze, starve, and simply give up. He was considered the settlement's authority on survival, and when he spoke, people listened. He climbed down from his wagon slowly, the way men do when they're carrying news they don't want to deliver. Elsa. He removed his hat. I came to see how you're managing. We're managing. He looked at the chicken coop with its gaps, the woodpile that was half what it should be, the children peering out the cabin window with frightened eyes. I know what it is to lose a spouse on this land, he said. I lost my Anna in 71. The loneliness, it doesn't kill you quick, but it grinds you down. You can't do this alone. No one can. I'm not alone. I have 3 children. Children aren't helpers. They're mouths. And this land, he gestured at the fields, the buildings, the endless work that needed doing. This land doesn't care that Eric is gone. It will take everything you have and demand more. What would you have me do? Carlson's weathered face shifted into something like pity. Nielsen has made you an offer. $3 an acre. I know it's robbery, the land is worth more than twice that. But it's survival. Sell to Nielsen. Take your children to Stillwater or Minneapolis. Find work. Find a husband. Don't let pride kill your family. Elsa felt something cold settle in her chest. Eric built this farm. Eric is dead. The words hung in the air between them. True. Brutal. Final. Every hour you spend fighting the impossible, Carlson continued, is an hour not spent preparing your garden, mending fences, or stacking firewood. Come September, when you have no food and no firewood and 3 children crying from hunger, you'll accept Nielsen's offer. Anyway, better to accept it now while you still have choices. Elsa said nothing. Carlson put his hat back on. I'm not your enemy. I'm trying to save your life. A woman alone with 3 children cannot work this land. The mathematics don't allow it. He climbed back into his wagon and drove away without looking back. That night, Elsa lay awake calculating. Carlson was right about the mathematics. They didn't work. $47, 3 children, 160 acres. Every way she ran the numbers, she came up short, unless she found a way to change what the numbers meant. In early November, Elsa began the brutal task of cleaning out Eric's things. His clothes went into a trunk for Anders to grow into. His tools stayed where he'd hung them. She would need every one. His books she kept on the shelf where his eyes had last rested on them. In a wooden box beneath the bed, she found his sketches. Eric had been a dreamer as well as a farmer. In the margins of his account books, and on scraps of paper saved from letters, he had drawn plans for the farm he meant to build. A larger barn with proper ventilation, a workshop with a forge for repairing equipment, a windmill for pumping water, and on 3 pages drawn in careful detail, an ice house. Elsa's hands trembled as she studied the sketches. double walls with a gap between them, a floor dug below the frost line, a drainage channel for meltwater. Notes in Eric's cramped handwriting covered the margins, like father's in Smoland. Sawdust free from mill, 10 inches thick for walls. Ice must be cut thick, 16 inches minimum. She remembered. In Sweden, in the village where she had grown up, her own father had kept an ice cellar. In January, the men of the village would cut blocks from the frozen lake and pack them in sawdust in the stone-walled cellars built into hillsides. The ice would last through summer. She remembered drinking cold milk in August, remembered butter that stayed firm even when the sun turned the fields golden. She had not thought of that cellar in years. In Minnesota, ice houses were luxuries, things that wealthy estate owners built, not poor immigrant farmers. She had assumed the technique required resources she didn't have, but Eric's sketches suggested otherwise. The Franconia sawmill stood 6 miles west on the St. Croix River. Sawmills produced mountains of sawdust, a waste product they burned or gave away because it had no value. The creek on her property, useless for a spring house, froze 18 inches thick by mid-January. She had a horse, children old enough to help with light work, and every tool Eric had owned. She sat with the sketches until the candle guttered and died, running calculations by memory. Ice needed 8 to 10 tons, 60 to 80 blocks. Sawdust needed 15 to 20 wagon loads, free. Lumber for walls. She could salvage boards from the collapsed outbuilding behind the barn, buy only what she couldn't scavenge. Time needed 5 to 6 weeks of brutal labor. The risk was enormous. Every hour spent building an ice house was an hour not spent on preparations everyone agreed were essential. If the ice house failed, if the ice melted by June, if the structure collapsed, if she'd misunderstood her father's technique, she would have wasted her only margin of error. But if it worked, she would have cold through summer, milk that stayed sweet, butter that stayed firm, meat that stayed fresh. The one thing no one else in the valley could offer. She was still holding the sketches when the sun came up. 3 days later, Anna Peterson rode over from the neighboring farm. Anna was 41, weathered by years of frontier life, but still handsome. She had been widowed herself, briefly, before remarrying. She understood the weight Elsa carried better than most. She found Elsa in the yard, measuring the ground behind the cabin with a length of rope. "What are you doing?" Elsa told her. Anna's face went through several expressions: confusion, concern, something that might have been fear. "Elsa, I understand you're trying to provide, but ice? Through summer? The old ways work: salting, smoking, drying. They've fed families for centuries. Salting nearly killed Carl last summer. That was bad luck, bad meat. It happens. It happens because there's no way to keep meat cold." Elsa pointed at the sketches, now pinned to a board. "In Sweden, my father—" "This isn't Sweden." Anna's voice was gentle but firm. "You're talking about cutting ice alone, hauling it, building a structure to hold it, and sawdust? Filling walls with sawdust? It will attract vermin. It's a fire risk. And if it fails, when it fails, you'll have lost weeks of work you can't afford to lose. If it works, I'll have cold milk in July. And if it doesn't work, you'll have nothing. No ice, no preserved meat, no time to make other arrangements." Anna reached out and took Elsa's hand. "I'm not saying this to be cruel. I'm saying it because I care about you, because I know what it is to face a winter alone, to lie awake calculating how long the food will last. Don't gamble everything on an idea that might not work." Elsa looked at the woman who had been her closest friend for 6 years. She saw real concern in Anna's eyes, real love. But she also saw someone who had accepted the limitations everyone else accepted. Someone who would have told her father he was foolish for building his ice cellar in Smoland. "I watched my son nearly die from spoiled meat," Elsa said. "I won't watch it again." Anna withdrew her hand. She looked at the sketches one more time, then back at Elsa. "I hope you're right," she said. "I truly do. But I think you're making a terrible mistake." She rode away without looking back. That night, Anders sat across from his mother at dinner and asked the question Elsa had been dreading. Mama, what if they're right? What if it doesn't work? Elsa looked at her son, 12 years old, trying so hard to be the man his father could no longer be. She saw Eric in his eyes, in the set of his jaw, in the stubborn way he met her gaze. Then we'll find another way, she said. But I have to try. Do you understand? I have to try. Anders nodded slowly. He didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. The next morning, Elsa began digging. Word spread the way it always did in small settlements, through glances at the general store, whispers after church, casual questions that carried anything but casual intent. Have you heard what the Lindqvist widow is doing? Building a palace for ice, they say. Her children's shoes have holes, but she's filling walls with sawdust. Grief does strange things to people. On the first Sunday of December, Elsa took her children to church in Lindström. It was 8 miles each way, a journey she made less often since Eric's death, but the children needed to see other people, needed to remember they were part of a community, even if that community viewed their mother with increasing suspicion. After the service, she heard Henrik Nielsen's voice carrying across the churchyard. Building a house for ice blocks. He was speaking to Carlson and 2 other men, loud enough that Elsa couldn't help but hear. While her children go hungry and her fences fall down, we'll see how long pride feeds them. Nielsen was 44, prosperous, the owner of 320 acres of the best farmland in the valley. He had made his offer of $3 an acre within a week of Eric's funeral, an offer so insultingly low that Elsa had simply stared at him until he left. But Nielsen was patient. He had been patient for 2 years, waiting for Eric to fail. Now he was waiting for Eric's widow to fail instead. Her land included the best creek bottom acreage in the area, land he had tried to buy from Eric twice before. He would wait as long as necessary. He turned and saw Elsa watching. A smile spread across his face, not warm, not kind, but satisfied. The smile of a man who knows time is on his side. After church, he approached her directly. Mrs. Lindqvist. He removed his hat with exaggerated courtesy. I've heard about your project, an ice house, isn't it? Quite ambitious. It's none of your concern, Mr. Nielsen. Everything that happens in this valley is my concern. I'm a man of business, and business means watching where opportunities arise. He glanced at her children who were helping load the wagon. I could help, you know. I could give you $5 for that lumber you're planning to use. You need money far more than you need firewood because that's all those boards will become when your little experiment fails. The lumber isn't for sale. Everything is for sale. That's a lesson the frontier teaches sooner or later. He leaned closer. His breath smelled of tobacco. You're going to fail, Mrs. Lindqvist. Not because you're foolish, though this icehouse business suggests otherwise, but because mathematics doesn't lie. A woman alone cannot work 160 acres, not with 3 children, not with $47, not with all the Swedish stubbornness in the world. My husband believed otherwise. Your husband is dead. The words hit like a slap. Elsa felt her face flush, felt her hands clench at her sides. She wanted to strike him. She wanted to scream. Instead, she said, "Get away from my wagon." Nielsen shrugged. As you wish, but remember my offer. $3 an acre, more than fair, considering what the land will be worth after you've let it go to ruin. When you're ready to discuss it, you know where to find me. He walked away, still smiling. On the drive home, Anders sat beside his mother in silence. Britta and Carl dozed in the back of the wagon, wrapped in blankets against the cold. Finally, Anders spoke. I hate him. So do I. He wants us to fail. Yes. We won't, will we? We won't fail? Elsa looked at her son. She thought about these $47, $38 now, after supplies for winter. She thought about the cords of wood she still needed to cut, the fences that needed mending, the ice house that existed only as sketches and hope. No, she said, we won't fail. She wished she believed it. The isolation began slowly, then accelerated. A neighbor who had promised to help with spring plowing sent word that he'd taken ill and couldn't spare the time. Another woman, who had always stopped to chat at the general store, suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere when Elsa appeared. Olaf Carlson rode past the farm twice that month, glanced at the excavation behind the cabin, and shook his head without stopping to speak. Elsa kept digging. The frozen ground fought her with every stroke. She swung the pickaxe until her arms burned, until blisters rose on her palms and burst and rose again. 3 feet down, that was the requirement in Eric's sketches. 3 feet below grade, where the earth stayed cool even in summer. Anders worked beside her after school, hauling away rocks and frozen soil in a wooden bucket. His hands cracked and bled, just like hers. He didn't complain. By December 20th, the excavation was complete. A rectangular pit, 10 feet by 12 feet, 3 feet deep. It looked like a grave. Some days it felt like one, but it was a beginning. Christmas came and went with little celebration. Elsa gave each child a small gift, a carved wooden horse for Carl, a ribbon for Britta's hair, a pocket knife for Anders. They sang hymns in Swedish, the way Eric had always insisted. They ate preserved meat and root vegetables and pretended the empty chair at the table wasn't there. The day after Christmas, Elsa hitched old Gustav to the wagon and drove to the Franconia sawmill. The mill foreman was a Dane named Henriksen, a man with enormous arms and a face permanently reddened by sun and wind. He listened to Elsa's request with growing amusement. "Sawdust? You want to haul away sawdust?" "As much as my wagon will hold. 15 or 20 loads." Henriksen laughed. "Lady, I'd pay you to haul it away if I could. We burn mountains of the stuff every week. Take as much as you want." He assigned 2 mill workers to help fill her wagon. They worked with the bemused efficiency of men who think they're witnessing insanity but don't care enough to argue. "What's it for?" one of them asked. "Insulation, for an ice house." The men exchanged glances. One of them shrugged. "Swedes," he said, as if that explained everything. Elsa made the 6-mile journey 3 times that week, then 4 times the next, then 4 more the week after. 15 loads of sawdust, piled in the corner of the barn, dry and light and smelling of pine sap. The children stuffed burlap sacks with it, sealed against moisture. By January 10th, she had enough. The walls went up next. She salvaged what she could from the collapsed outbuilding, boards warped by years of weather, but still serviceable. For the rest, she paid $18 to a lumber dealer in Lindstrom, nearly half her remaining funds. The wood arrived on January 15th, stacked in the yard like a promise, or a threat. Elsa couldn't build the walls alone. She needed help, and help was suddenly scarce. The neighbors who might have offered labor were keeping their distance. The men who might have worked for wages wanted nothing to do with a project everyone called foolish. On January 16th, a young man appeared at her door. He was perhaps 22, with the sunburned face and calloused hands of someone who worked outdoors. His name was Johan, he said. He was passing through on his way to the lumber camps up north. He was looking for work, just a few days' worth, enough to buy supplies for the journey. "I can build," he said. "Walls, roofs, whatever you need, $2 a day." Elsa studied him. He looked honest enough, though she had learned the hard way that looks meant nothing. More importantly, he looked strong, and he was here, which was more than she could say for her neighbors. "I can't pay $2. I can pay 1 and meals, and I can give you 4 chickens when you leave." Johan considered this. "The chickens good layers?" "The best I have." "Then we have a deal." For 3 days, Johan and Elsa worked from first light until they could no longer see. They built a double wall, an outer shell of boards, an inner shell 6 inches within, the gap between them ready for sawdust. They built a door thick enough to stop heat, with a frame that would seal tight. They installed a drainage channel at the floor's lowest point, angled to carry meltwater away. Johan didn't ask questions. He didn't offer opinions. He simply worked, with the focused efficiency of a man who understood that time was money and both were running short. On January 19th, the walls were complete. Johann accepted his 4 chickens and his $6 and his 3 days' worth of meals. He shook Elsa's hand at the wagon. "The walls are good," he said. "Strong. But that ice, you're going to have to cut it yourself, aren't you?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Good luck. You're going to need it." He drove away into the gray January morning. Elsa stood in the yard and looked at what she'd built. Walls without a roof, a shell without a soul, an ice house that held no ice, 65 blocks to cut, 3 weeks until the creek began to thaw. She couldn't afford to wait another day. The creek froze 18 inches thick by mid-January, thick enough for the blocks Eric's sketches demanded. Elsa borrowed a crosscut saw from old man Erickson, who had stopped speaking to her but couldn't quite bring himself to refuse a widow's request. She borrowed ice tongs from another neighbor under similar terms. Then she went to work. Cutting ice was brutality made physical. The saw bit into the frozen surface with a sound like screaming. Water seeped up through the cut, soaking her gloves, freezing her fingers. Each block took 20 minutes of labor, sawing the 4 sides, prying it loose, dragging it onto the sledge behind old Gustav. 3 blocks the first day. Her arms were on fire by noon. By evening, she couldn't lift them above her shoulders. 4 blocks the second day. She found a rhythm, saw, pry, drag, rest. The rest periods grew longer as the day went on. Anders joined her on the 3rd day. He was 12 years old, too young for this labor, but old enough to refuse being left behind. They worked together, one on each end of the crosscut saw, and managed 5 blocks before darkness forced them to stop. "How many more?" Anders asked that night, barely able to hold his spoon at dinner. 60. He was quiet for a long moment. "We can do it." Elsa wasn't sure. The deadline wasn't arbitrary. Once the creek began to soften in early March, the ice became too fragile to cut, too thin to use. They had perhaps 20 cutting days left, 20 days to harvest 60 blocks with nothing but their own strength and 1 aging horse. The math didn't work. The math couldn't work. On the 7th day, Elsa fell through a thin spot near the bank. The water was only waist deep, but the shock of cold nearly stopped her heart. She dragged herself out, soaked and shaking, and kept working because stopping meant death just as surely as drowning. By the 14th day, they had 45 blocks. By the 17th day, 52. Elsa's weight had dropped visibly. Her hands were a ruin of blisters and cracked skin. She had developed a cough that wouldn't quit, probably from the days she'd fallen through, the cold water settling into her lungs. They needed 13 more blocks. 3 days of good weather would do it. 3 days of hard labor, and no mistakes, and bodies that somehow held together. But the weather was turning. Clouds piled up from the west. The temperature rose by a few precious degrees, enough to make the ice groan, to soften it at the edges. They might have days. They might have hours. There was no way to know. On the 18th day, Elsa woke to find a wagon in her yard. Anna Peterson climbed down, followed by her 2 teenage sons. Neither of the boys looked happy to be there. Neither of them said a word. Anna walked to where Elsa stood, too exhausted for surprise. "I brought help," Anna said. 3 days' worth. My boys are strong. They'll cut whatever you need." Elsa's voice cracked. "You said I was making a mistake." "I did. I might still be right." Anna's face was hard, unreadable. "But you're going to make your mistake or not, and you're going to do it with help. That's what neighbors do, even when they think each other are fools." Elsa wanted to argue, wanted to thank her, wanted to weep. Instead, she handed Anna the crosscut saw. "We need 13 more blocks," she said, "and the weather's turning." "Then we'd better hurry." For 3 days, 5 people worked the frozen creek. The Peterson boys were strong and fast, cutting blocks at twice, the speed Elsa and Anders could manage. Anna worked beside her, speaking little, laboring with the grim determination of a woman settling a debt she hadn't known she owed. On the 20th day, they hauled the 68th block into the ice house. Elsa stood in the doorway, watching the last of the sawdust settle between the layers. 68 blocks of ice, stacked in neat rows, each layer separated by 6 inches of sawdust insulation. 8 tons of frozen water, harvested from a creek that had begun to crack and shift, carried by a horse that could barely stand, cut by hands that had forgotten what it felt like not to hurt. Anna came to stand beside her. "It's done," Elsa said. "The building is done. The ice is stored. But the test hasn't come." Anna looked at her with something that might have been respect or pity, or both. "Summer will tell the truth of it. July will know what you've built." She gathered her sons. They drove away without ceremony. Elsa closed the ice house door. The seal held tight. The walls stood solid. Inside, in the darkness, 8 tons of ice waited for a summer that was still 5 months away. Outside, the temperature began to drop again. February arrived with bitter cold and howling wind. But Elsa Lindqvist barely noticed. She had done everything she could, built the walls, harvested the ice, packed the sawdust, sealed the door. Now she could only wait, and pray that she hadn't just wasted the last of her strength on a dream that would melt away in the summer sun. Spring arrived in fits and starts, warm days that teased, cold snaps that punished, mud that swallowed boots and wagon wheels alike. Elsa checked the ice house every week, sometimes twice. In April, she cracked the door and felt cold air rush past her face. The ice had shrunk, perhaps 10% lost to slow melting, but the core remained solid, frozen, waiting. In May, she checked again. More shrinkage. The blocks that had once filled the space now left gaps along their walls. Meltwater trickled through the drainage channel, evidence of the ongoing battle between summer's approach and winter's stored cold. But the ice remained. On June 1st, Elsa opened the door and stepped inside. The thermometer she'd hung on the interior wall read 42 degrees. Outside, the temperature had climbed to 78, a 36-degree difference. The walls were holding. She brought a pail of fresh milk from the morning's milking and set it on a block of ice. 2 hours later, the milk was cold. Sweet. Perfect. That evening, she served her children cold milk with their dinner. Carl drank 2 cups without stopping. "It tastes like winter," he said, and Elsa had to turn away so he wouldn't see her tears. For 6 weeks, the ice house delivered everything she had hoped. Milk stayed sweet for 3 days instead of souring within hours. Butter remained firm in a crock set against the ice. The small amount of fresh meat she could afford lasted nearly a week before showing any signs of turning. Anders gained weight. Britta's color improved. Even Carl, always the frailest of the 3, seemed stronger. Olaf Carlson stopped by in early June. He walked around the ice house, running his hands along the walls, examining the door seal, studying the drainage channel where meltwater still trickled. "You've done well," he admitted. "The ice has lasted longer than I expected." "It will last through summer." Carlson shook his head. "You've preserved perhaps 5 tons, maybe 6. That's impressive. But wait until the real heat comes. July and August. That's when the truth reveals itself. A few warm weeks in June prove nothing." He left without offering congratulations. But Elsa had seen something in his eyes, something that looked almost like doubt, not in her, but in his own certainty. July arrived. The temperature climbed, 80 degrees, 85, 90. The ice held. On July 9th, the thermometer on the porch read 94 degrees. Elsa checked the ice house. Interior temperature, 44 degrees. A 50-degree difference. The ice had shrunk to perhaps 4 tons, but 4 tons was enough. 4 tons would last. July 10th, 97 degrees. July 11th, 99 degrees. Elsa watched the sky and felt something building. The air had turned thick, heavy, hard to breathe. The animals were restless, the cow lowing for no reason, the chickens huddled in shade, old Gustav standing motionless in the paddock with his head down. Something was coming. On July 12th, The temperature reached 102 degrees before noon. The heat wave had arrived. The heat didn't break at night. That was the worst part. In a normal Minnesota summer, brutal days gave way to cool evenings. The land exhaled, the air softened, bodies could recover from the punishment of the sun. But this heat was different. This heat had weight and permanence. It squatted over the land like something alive and hungry. July 12th. 1. 102 degrees. Nighttime low, 77. July 13th, 101 degrees. Nighttime low, 78. July 14th, 103 degrees. Nighttime low, 79. The creek that had provided Elsa's ice slowed to a trickle, then stopped entirely. The milk cow's production dropped by half. She stood in whatever shade she could find. Too hot to eat, too miserable to give. The chickens stopped laying. Grass that had been green turned yellow, then brown. It crackled underfoot like paper. Twice Elsa saw smoke rising in the distance, grass fires sparked by nothing more than sun and dryness. On July 14th, Anna Peterson appeared at the door. She looked 10 years older than she had in February. Her face was drawn, her eyes hollow. She clutched a bundle wrapped in cloth against her chest like a baby. "Our butter," she said. Her voice was carefully controlled, but Elsa could hear the tremor beneath. "All of it. Gone. The cream won't set. The milk sours within hours. My children—" She stopped, swallowed. "I need ice. Please. Anything you can spare." Elsa led her to the ice house. The interior temperature read 40 degrees, 63 degrees cooler than the hell outside. Anna gasped when the cold air hit her face. Elsa chipped a block of ice in half and wrapped it in burlap. "Take this. Put your butter against it. It will keep for days." Anna took the ice. Tears ran down her face, cutting channels through the dust. "I said you were making a mistake. I said, you helped me cut ice when I needed it most. This is what neighbors do." Anna left without another word. By July 15th, 3 more families had come to Elsa's door. The Ericksons, whose smoked pork had begun to weep in the heat. The Johanssons, whose children had stopped eating because the food tasted of rot. Old widow Magnuson, who had no family left but couldn't bear to lose the butter she'd been saving for winter. Elsa gave ice to all of them. Small. Blocks, carefully rationed, but enough to make a difference. Enough to keep food from spoiling for a few more days. The icehouse thermometer held steady at 39 degrees. Outside, the world was burning. On the morning of July 16th, Carl woke with a fever. At first, Elsa thought it was just the heat. All the children were suffering, listless, irritable, refusing food. But by noon, Carl's temperature had climbed beyond what the weather could explain. His skin burned to the touch. His eyes, when they opened, were glassy and unfocused. "Mama," he whispered, "I don't feel good." Elsa stripped him down to his underclothes and laid him on the bed. She soaked cloths in water from the well and draped them across his forehead, his chest, his legs. The cloths grew warm within minutes. By evening, his temperature was still rising. Anders rode to Lindstrom as fast as old Gustav could carry him. The doctor there, a German named Hoffman, was already overwhelmed. 3 families in town had cases of heat stroke. 2 children had died that morning. "I'll come as soon as I can," he told Anders. 2 days, maybe 3. Keep him cool. Keep him hydrated. That's all you can do. Anders rode home in the dark, pushing the old horse to its limits. He delivered the news to his mother at midnight. 2 days, maybe 3. Carl's fever was 104 degrees and climbing. July 17th. Temperature 101 degrees. Elsa hadn't slept. She sat beside Carl's bed, replacing the cloths every few minutes, trickling water between his cracked lips. He had stopped asking for food, stopped asking for anything. He lay still except for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. Britta and Anders took turns fetching water, wringing cloths, watching their brother die by degrees. Because that's what was happening. Elsa knew it. She had seen fever take children before, in Sweden, on the ship to America, in the early years on the frontier. She knew what it looked like when a small body couldn't fight anymore. At noon, she made a decision. Anders, Britta, come with me. She led them to the ice house, opened the door. The cold rushed out like a blessing. We're going to bring the ice to him, she said, as much as we need, as long as it takes. She chipped ice into small pieces and wrapped them in cloth. She filled a bucket with ice water. She carried everything back to the cabin while her children followed with more. Carl's eyes fluttered open when she pressed the ice-wrapped cloth to his forehead. Cold, he whispered. Yes, baby, cold. She gave him chips of ice to suck. She bathed his burning skin with ice water. She changed the cloths every few minutes, replacing warm compresses with cold ones, fighting his fever degree by degree. The temperature outside climbed to 102. Inside the cabin, surrounded by ice, Carl's fever dropped by half a degree. Then another. Then another. July 18th. Temperature, 103 degrees. Elsa had been awake for 40 hours. Her hands shook when she lifted the cloths. Her vision blurred and swam. Twice she caught herself falling asleep while sitting beside Carl's bed and jerked awake to find minutes had passed. But Carl was still alive. His fever had stabilized at 101, still dangerous, but no longer climbing. The ice was working. The cold was fighting the heat that was trying to kill him. More neighbors came that day. Elsa heard their voices at the door, heard Anders and Britta turning them away or sending them to the ice house to take what they needed. The Carlson family arrived in the afternoon. Their smoked pork had spoiled overnight, all of it, the meat they'd been planning to live on through winter. Olaf Carlson stood in the yard, hat in hand, unable to meet Elsa's eyes. Help yourself, she called from the doorway. Take what you need. He nodded, didn't speak. Walked to the ice house like a man walking to his own hanging. At sunset, the temperature finally dropped below 100. The ice house thermometer read 38 degrees. The ice was holding. Carl opened his eyes. Mama, I'm thirsty. Elsa wept. July 19th. Temperature, 103 degrees. The peak of the heat wave. Carl's fever had dropped to 99, still warm, but no longer dangerous. He had eaten a few spoonfuls of broth. He had smiled at his sister. Elsa allowed herself to believe he might survive. Then Henrik Nilsson appeared at the door. He looked destroyed. His fine clothes were soaked with sweat, stained with dirt. His face was gray beneath its sunburn. He held his hat in both hands like a man at a funeral. My dairy cow, he said. His voice cracked. My best cow. She died in the night. The heat she couldn't... He stopped, started again. My smoked meat is spoiling, all of it. The butter's gone. My family... He couldn't finish the sentence. Elsa looked at the man who had circled her farm like a vulture, who had offered her $3 an acre for land worth $8, who had told the whole valley she would fail because a woman alone could not work the land. She could refuse him. She had every right. He had done nothing but wish her failure since the day Eric died. The ice house is behind the cabin, she said. Take what you need. Nielsen stared at her. His mouth opened and closed. No words came out. Take what you need, she repeated, and then go. He walked to the ice house without looking back. Elsa watched him go and felt nothing, no triumph, no satisfaction, only exhaustion so deep it had become a physical weight. At 2 o'clock, the temperature hit 103 degrees, the highest reading of the heat wave. At 4 o'clock, smoke appeared on the horizon. A grass fire had started near the Carlson farm, sparked by nothing anyone could identify. Within an hour, half the men in the valley were fighting it with shovels and wet blankets and prayers. The fire burned until dark. It consumed 40 acres of grassland and 2 outbuildings before the wind shifted and drove it into a creek bed where it could spread no further. 3 cows died, 12 chickens, a season's worth of hay gone in an hour. The Lindqvist farm was untouched. The ice house stood solid. Inside, 3 tons of ice remained, enough to last another month if necessary. Carl slept peacefully through the night, his fever finally broken. July 20th. Dr. Hoffman arrived at noon, exhausted from treating cases across the county. He examined Carl with gentle hands, checking pulse and temperature and pupil response. "The fever's broken," he said. "His lungs are clear. He's going to be fine." Elsa nodded. She had known, but hearing it from someone else made it real. Hoffman looked around the cabin at the buckets of ice water, the cloths hanging to dry, the makeshift cooling system Elsa had built from desperation and frozen water. "How did you keep him cool?" he asked. "In this heat? Without proper equipment?" "Ice," Elsa said. "You have ice? In July?" She led him to the ice house. He stood in the doorway, feeling the cold air rush past him, staring at the blocks of ice still stacked in neat rows. "I don't understand. How is this possible?" "Double walls," Elsa said. "Sawdust insulation. Ice cut from the creek in January. My husband's design." Hoffman shook his head slowly. "I've treated 11 cases of heat-related illness in the past week. 4 children have died. 4. He turned to look at her. "You kept your son cooler than I could have in my own office, with ice. In the middle of the worst heat wave this region has seen in a decade." "He's going to be fine," Elsa repeated. It was the only thing she could think to say. "Yes, he is." Hoffman reached out and touched the wall of the ice house. "You should build more of these. The whole county should have them." "I know." July 21st. Temperature 94 degrees. The heat was breaking. Clouds gathered on the western horizon, heavy with the promise of rain. The air felt lighter, more breathable. Animals that had stood motionless for days began to move again. Carl ate his first solid meal since the fever began, boiled eggs and bread and cold milk from the ice house. He asked for seconds. Britta laughed at something Anders said. The sound startled them all. It had been days since anyone had laughed about anything. Elsa walked to the ice house and opened the door. Interior temperature 39 degrees. Ice remaining, approximately 3 tons. Enough to last the rest of summer with careful rationing. She had done it. The ice house had worked. July 22nd. Temperature 88 degrees. Anna Peterson arrived with gifts, preserved fruit from her cellar, cloth for making new clothes for the children, a jar of honey she'd been saving for a special occasion. "You saved us," she said. "That block of ice you gave me, it saved 2 weeks of butter production. Saved the cream, my family. Needed." She set her gifts on the table. "I said you were making a mistake. I said the old ways were better. I was wrong. You helped me when I needed it most. That doesn't excuse what I said. It doesn't need to." Elsa touched the cloth. Good quality. Enough for a dress for Britta and perhaps a shirt for Anders. "Thank you. For the help, then. For this now." Anna nodded. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Teach me, please, how to build one. My family needs. I'll teach you. I'll teach anyone who wants to learn." July 23rd. The heat wave broke with a thunderstorm that dropped temperatures by 30 degrees in an hour. Rain hammered the parched earth, filling the creek beds, soaking the blackened fields where the fire had burned. Lightning split the sky in great white forks. The children pressed their faces to the window and watched the storm like it was the most beautiful thing they'd ever seen. When it passed, the air smelled clean, new, full of possibility. Carl fell asleep that night without fever, without pain, without fear. He was still weak. It would be weeks before he fully recovered, but he was alive. He would grow up. He would remember this summer as the time his mother saved him with ice. Elsa stood in the doorway and watched the stars emerge from behind the clearing clouds. The temperature had dropped to 62 degrees. A cool breeze carried the smell of wet earth and growing things. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear cattle lowing, life returning to normal, the valley healing from what it had survived. On July 25th, Olaf Carlson's wagon rolled into the yard. He climbed down slowly, the way he always did, but something was different about the set of his shoulders. He walked to where Elsa stood watching and removed his hat. I was wrong. The words hung in the morning air. Elsa waited. I told you to sell. I told you a woman alone couldn't work this land. I told you your ice house was foolishness. That would cost you everything. He turned the hat in his hands, studying the brim as if it contained words he was searching for. I was wrong. About all of it. What happened to your family? Carlson's face twisted. We lost 30% of our smoked pork. The meat I was counting on to feed my family through winter, it rotted in 3 days. 3 of my chickens died from the heat. A pig we were raising for slaughter stopped eating and never recovered. He looked up at her. Your family lost nothing. Your ice house, your husband's design. It worked exactly as you said it would. I'm sorry for your losses. Don't be. I earned them. He put his hat back on and straightened his spine. I came to ask for your advice. I want to build an ice house before next winter. Will you teach me? Elsa thought about all the times this man had dismissed her, all the times he had told her to give up, to sell out, to accept that she couldn't succeed. She thought about how his doubt had made the hard months harder. I'll teach you, she said. I'll teach anyone who wants to learn. Carlson nodded. His eyes were wet. Your husband would be proud. I know. The conversions came quickly after that. The Johanssons asked for guidance on building an ice house by the end of July. The Ericssons followed a week later. By August, 4 families were planning construction for the coming winter, all using Eric Lindqvist's designs. The numbers told the story more clearly than any words could. Elsa's losses during the heatwave, none. 0% of preserved food spoiled. All 3 children survived and healthy. The Peterson family lost 40% of preserved meat, 100% of July butter production. Total value lost, approximately $18. The Carlson family lost 30% of preserved meat, 3 chickens, 1 pig to heat stress. Total value lost, approximately $23. The Nilsson family lost their prize dairy cow worth $35, most preserved meat, all butter production. Total value lost, approximately $52. The mathematics that Olaf Carlson had insisted would doom Elsa had instead doomed everyone who refused to try something new. Anna Peterson came by in early August with her husband and her 2 sons, the same sons who had helped cut ice in February. They wanted to see the ice house again, to understand the construction details, to make notes for their own building project. The walls are the key, Elsa explained, walking them through the structure. Double walls with 10 inches of sawdust between them. The sawdust has to stay dry. Moisture destroys its insulating properties. The floor must be below grade, 3 feet at least, where the earth stays cool even in summer. She showed them the drainage channel, the door seal, the ventilation at the peak. She explained how to pack the ice blocks with sawdust between each layer, how to minimize door openings, how to calculate the ice. Harvest needed to last through summer. Anna's husband, a quiet man named Per, listened carefully and made sketches in a small notebook. How much ice did you start with? He asked. 8 tons, 68 blocks. We lost about 5 tons to melting over the summer, but 5 tons was more than enough. And the sawdust? 15 wagon loads from the Franconia mill. They gave it away for free. It's a waste product for them. Any sawmill will do the same. Per Peterson nodded and kept writing. By the time they left, he had filled 10 pages with notes and drawings. The ice house that had made Elsa a laughingstock was becoming the most valuable structure in the valley. Henrik Nilsson never apologized. He never came back to thank her for the ice that had saved what remained of his food stores. He never acknowledged that he had been wrong about her chances of survival, wrong about a woman's ability to work the land, wrong about everything. But he stopped his campaign to acquire her property. At church the following Sunday, when someone mentioned the Lindqvist widow's ice house, Nilsson said nothing. He stared straight ahead, his face carefully blank, his silence speaking louder than any words. His offer of $3 an acre was never repeated. The land that Eric Lindqvist had claimed and Elsa Lindqvist had kept remained in the family. That autumn, 4 families began construction on ice houses. The Petersons built theirs closest to the Swedish design: double walls, sawdust insulation, below-grade floor. The Carlsons added a second chamber for storing vegetables alongside the ice. The Johanssons experimented with straw insulation when sawdust proved difficult to transport from the distant mill. All 4 structures were completed before the first freeze. By January 1887, all 4 had been filled with ice harvested from the same creek where Elsa had nearly drowned 1 year earlier. By July 1887, all 4 were still functioning when another heat wave, smaller than the previous years, but still brutal, swept across the valley. No family that had built an ice house lost food to spoilage that summer. No children died of fever that could have been treated with cold compresses and ice water. The innovation was spreading. The impossible thing had become commonplace. By 1890, 11 ice houses stood in the valley. By 1900, nearly every farm in Chisago County had some form of cold storage based on the Swedish immigrant designs that had seemed so foolish 15 years earlier. The laughingstock had become the standard. The widow's folly had become everyone's wisdom. Young homesteaders who came to the area in the 1890s assumed ice houses had always been part of frontier life. They didn't know that the technique had been rejected, mocked, dismissed as impossible. They didn't know that one woman had risked everything on a dead husband's sketches. They simply built ice houses because that was what everyone did. Innovation has a way of becoming invisible once it succeeds. Elsa Lindqvist never remarried. Some of the men in the valley proposed after the heat wave had proved her capable, and the ice house had proved her clever. A widow with 160 acres and a reputation for intelligence was no small prize. But Elsa declined every offer with the same quiet firmness she had shown when declining Nielsen's attempts to buy her land. "I have enough company," she would say. "I have my children, I have my farm, I have my husband's memory. That's enough." She raised all 3 children on the land Eric had claimed. Anders took over the homestead in 1898 when he was 24 years old. He expanded it to 320 acres over the next decade, buying the land Henrik Nielsen's heirs were forced to sell when their father's debts came due. The Lindqvist farm became one of the most prosperous in the county, a legacy built on ice blocks and sawdust, and one woman's refusal to accept what everyone told her was impossible. Britta became a schoolteacher in Lindström. She married a minister's son and raised 4 children of her own. On summer visits home, she would take her children to see the ice house their grandmother had built and tell them the story of the heat wave. Carl, the boy whose fever had broken on ice-cooled cloths, who had been hours from death when his mother pressed frozen water against his burning skin, lived to 91 years old. He died in 1972, in a world of electric refrigeration and air conditioning and frozen foods available in every grocery store. A world that had forgotten what it meant to harvest ice from frozen rivers and pack it in sawdust and pray it would last until September. But Carl never forgot. Every summer until his last, he would stand in whatever shade he could find and tell whoever would listen about the summer of 1886. About the heat wave that killed cattle and spoiled food and sent children to early graves. About his mother, who had kept him alive with ice blocks and cold cloths and a determination that defied every prediction of failure. "She saved my life with winter," he would say. "She carried winter right through summer and used it to save my life." Elsa herself died in 1923 at 82 years old in the same cabin where she had pressed ice to her son's burning forehead 37 summers earlier. Her children were with her at the end, so were 11 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren. The ice house stood until 1942. By then, rural electrification had reached Chisago County, bringing refrigerators and freezers and rendering the old ice house obsolete. Anders's son, Elsa's grandson, tore it down to make way for a modern dairy barn. But he kept the foundation stones. They still mark the spot today, moss-covered and settling into the Minnesota soil. A rectangle of shaped granite 10 feet by 12 feet, outlining the place where a widow's folly once held 8 tons of frozen water. If you know where to look, you can still find them. The principle Elsa Lindqvist applied in 1886, thermal mass insulation, passive cooling, locally sourced materials, is now studied by sustainable architects seeking alternatives to energy-intensive refrigeration. What seemed like peasant knowledge to her neighbors was, in fact, sophisticated applied physics. The sawdust provided approximately R1 insulation per inch. 10 inches of cavity meant R10 walls, enough to maintain a 60-degree temperature differential between interior and exterior. The below-grade floor took advantage of the Earth's constant 55-degree temperature. The massive ice blocks acted as a thermal battery, absorbing heat slowly and releasing cold steadily. Engineers with advanced degrees now design buildings based on these same principles. They call it passive cooling and thermal mass, storage, and sustainable architecture. They publish papers about it in academic journals. They win awards for innovations that Swedish farmers understood 2 centuries ago. Elsa Lindqvist had no engineering degree. She had 3 years of schooling in a village in Småland, a dead husband's sketches, and the memory of cold milk in August from her father's ice cellar. That was enough. A summer morning in 1887. 1 year after the heat wave. Elsa Lindqvist stood in her yard as the sun rose over the Minnesota prairie. The light was golden, gentle, nothing like the brutal blaze of the previous July. A cool breeze carried the smell of growing corn and ripening wheat. She walked to the ice house and opened the door. Cool air rushed past her, carrying the faint sweetness of sawdust and the clean emptiness of cold. Inside, blocks of ice glowed faintly blue in the shadows. This year's harvest, cut from the same creek, packed with the same sawdust, waiting for whatever summer might bring. Insurance. That's what it was. Insurance against heat waves and failed crops and children's fevers and neighbors' doubt. Insurance against a world that had told her she couldn't survive. She touched the nearest block. The ice was smooth under her fingers, solid, patient. It would last until September. It would keep her family fed. It would prove again that the impossible thing was possible after all. Behind her, she heard the cabin door open. Carl emerged, still thin from his illness, but growing stronger every day. He ran to her across the yard, his feet bare in the summer grass. "Mama, Britta says breakfast is ready." Elsa closed the ice house door, sealed the cold inside, turned to face her son. "Then let's eat," she said. She took his hand. They walked together toward the cabin, toward the smell of cooking and the sounds of Anders and Britta arguing about something trivial and the ordinary miracle of a family that had survived. The ice house stood solid behind them. The sun climbed higher. The day grew warm, but not too warm, not warm enough to matter. Elsa Lindqvist had built a house for ice, and her neighbors had laughed. Then summer came, and they remembered the frontier had always belonged to those who refused to be told what was impossible.